All right, so the next way of knowing that we explored was ethics, which we've explored in class, but ethics is the language of right and wrong, which determines our rights and responsibilities. So essentially, ethics is a system of moral principles that we follow. So the first idea is moral absolutism, which we defined earlier, and as we previously disclosed, we believe that rape and murder are never justified. Ideally, all nations and cultures should support this moral principle, and the Indian government's decision to ban the movie could reflect its wish to ignore rape and murder and prevent conversation because of its own set of ideals. So, seeing freedom of speech as a moral absolute, the banning of the movie goes against this ideal set by the United Nations in Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights, because people should have the freedom to speak up. However, an implication of believing in moral absolutism is that there's a difficulty in establishing a common ground between cultures to find these ethics, which causes it essentially to be quite unrealistic. So although globalization looks to standardize moral principles, India's own ethical principles, which are strongly tied to its culture, could be considered not yet the same as the rest of the world. So a counter-argument to the idea of moral absolutism is the idea of moral relativism, which is the proposal that there's no universal set of values and that ethics are determined by culture. So as a Western body, we cannot determine what should be considered right and wrong in an Indian society or in a culture other than our own. So moral absolutism could be considered an idealistic system, whereas moral relativism is much more realistic. The regulation of people's voices, which we as a Western body might regard as suppression, might be the way that the Indian culture functions, and we should not question that. However, an implication of this belief is that it leads to a certain level of tolerance and desensitization towards certain matters, as we dismiss them as culturally justified. This gives us a disincentive to question what is happening in our surrounding societies, and so this idea seems less superior than moral absolutism. The last idea is duty ethics, which is also a counter-argument to our initial argument, which is the idea of fulfilling of obligations of duties, So here we have a quote by George Bernard Shaw, who was the co-founder of LSE and an Irish playwright, and he said, "When a stupid man is doing something he is ashamed of, he always declares it is his duty." So the government of India might claim that it is its duty to ban the movie in order to preserve the culture, and if people are exposed to the negative portrayal of their culture, they might crave reform. So even though the government is ashamed of what has happened, or they might be banning the movie to preserve order and peace, as I said earlier. And this applies because there were a lot of violent protests following Jyoti's death, and they might believe that this will happen again. So the quote is applicable to the situation because they are excusing an issue that they're ashamed of. However, the Indian government has identified itself as a democracy, which is a system of government in which all the people of a state or polity are involved in making decisions about its affairs. So the government's duty is to present all the information concerning an issue to the population. This means that the system that the government has enforced goes against the idea of regulation or banning of the movie. Also, it is the duty of a government to protect its citizens, and citizens cannot be protected unless they are well aware and exposed to the dangers that surround them. Thus, we decided that duty ethics can be deemed irrelevant. Another way of knowing is reason. Reason is the process of having evidence that leads you to a conclusion. So the first idea is circular reasoning, which is the idea that an argument leads to a restated argument. So an example of this would be, for a job you need experience, but to get experience you need a job. This applies to this situation because the government might believe that for change you need people to understand, but for people to understand you need change. The government might believe that the documentary won't change anything because of the idea of circular reasoning. However, an implication of the belief of circular reasoning is that it gives us a disincentive to change, which we mentioned earlier, and essentially makes change appear unattainable. The next idea is epistemology, which is also a counter-argument. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that investigates the origin, nature, methods, and limits of human knowledge. Essentially, we would define epistemology as the theory of knowledge. Human knowledge will always be limited, is the idea that epistemology shares, and physically we cannot know everything about the world. So the banning of the documentary doesn't significantly limit the public's knowledge, as the government might have stated, as there's other knowledge that might be more pertinent to them at the time. However, an implication of the belief of epistemology is that it gives the authority an excuse to leave out certain facts without allowing the public to have any say in the knowledge they are exposed to, which goes against the idea of democracy.
Alright, so the other key idea that we want to highlight in reason is the idea that appeal to authority can often lead to logical fallacies. A logical fallacy, it's an error of reasoning and basically making an argument based on a false piece of information. And an appeal to authority is the reliance on authorities to make up our own minds. Basically, this could be used as a counter-argument. The Indian government could claim that the position taken by the convicts' lawyers, who were educated and who were supposed to be the representative of the law authorities, which were expressed in the movie, could possibly lead to logical fallacies. Their lawyers, the lawyers of the convicts, were in complete agreement with what the convicts had actually done. One of them actually said that he would, if his daughter or sister engaged in premarital activities, he would douse her with petrol and burn her in front of his whole family. So in this sense, the ban seems excusable because people could come to the logical fallacy that since the educated lawyers support the convicts, so can I. Since the educated lawyers would burn their own daughter, so can I. However, on the other hand, and more importantly, the government's decision to ban the movie can also be applied to the same principle. If the government decides to ignore this issue, so can I. So the banning of the movie makes the public think that ignorance is justifiable. A major implication of all of these is that this way of thinking limits societies, breeding ignorance and giving the public and government an incentive not to change.
So the ideas that we've identified can also be applied to different real-life situations, one of which can be found within education, specifically Japanese history textbooks. So here are some examples of how the regulation of knowledge is found within education. Of Japan's invasion of China, books published in 1980s referred to the invasion as an advance. Also, in descriptions of the demonstration of Seoul on March 1st in 1919, where independence from Japan was declared, we see that in Korean history textbooks, there's immense detail about the brutal suppression of the demonstrators, which led to 6,000 deaths and 15,000 wounded. However, in some Japanese textbooks, we're only exposed to the demonstration being described as a riot, and the death tolls are not even mentioned. So this is another form of regulation of knowledge and the distortion of facts throughout history that serves to better the view of a certain society, whether it be the Indian government through the banning of India's daughter, or whether it be Japan through the banning of, or the regulation of knowledge through textbooks. So this is similar to India's daughter in that the presentation of and content of knowledge is being changed in the interest of a certain group.
Another way that we can look at this knowledge question is by defining authority differently. We looked at it as the government, but we can also look at it as media outlets and how they are able to regulate the knowledge accessible to the general public. As we know, the first thing that came into my mind was actually propaganda, and which is commonly used to control public opinion and create consent. Media outlets like newspapers, TV, the internet, magazines, they control the spread of knowledge and usually supporting the government's own ideals and policies. But this is not always true. In the case of the position of President João Goulart in Brazil in 1964, the press went against the government, denouncing his political leadership, and which led to revolts and a revolution. However, another point that's important to highlight is the idea that Noam Chomsky proposed on his book, Necessary Illusions. Here's a quote by him: "In the democracy system, the necessary illusions cannot be imposed by force. Rather, they must be instilled in the public mind by more subtle means." By those subtle means, for those of you who were in Mr. Peake's class, he means the distractions. He means the using television, using different mediums of media to create illusions that we're being involved in society. Nowadays, most TV channels and the internet serve to entertain its users, and the regulation of the information shared by such mediums can lead to the lack of involvement of society with major issues, which together with the distortion of knowledge is a major implication of the regulation of knowledge by media outlets. So, to conclude, the main implications that we found with this question was that the ignorance towards certain important issues seemed to have an effect on the development of societies and ways to overcome certain issues, as well as the governments being allowed to excuse their action by banning India's dollar, for example, to serve their best interest. And in response to the overall knowledge question, we both believe that the regulation of knowledge should not be allowed, as although it may have minor trivial effects on society, in the long run, regulation will impede any hope for development. Thank you.